Welcome back, everyone. Or if you're new here, hello, welcome. Today, I'm here to bring a new discussion series to the channel where the goal is to analyze every single type of unit in their respective weapon and class type, and giving advice about whether or not you should invest into certain units. In the first episode of this series, I'll be discussing Sword Infantry demotes. Just to preface this, basically I'm just going to be going over accessible units. I'm not going to be counting 5 stars, I'm not going to be counting seasonal demotes, unless they're grails. I'm only going to be counting units that you can get really easily in the normal summoning pool, basically your 3 and 4 stars, as well as your grail units. Because those are the most accessible units when it comes to the game, in general. And I'll be rating them based on 2 factors. I'll be doing a performance rating and a cost rating. And to go over those real quick, a performance rating is basically complete subjectivity based on how I believe they hold up in the current meta. Whether or not they are better or worse than I'm ranking them is completely opinionated. I absolutely believe that you can make an argument for any unit on this list. And the cost rating is basically the barrier of entry when it comes to using these units. Basically, how many skills you have to inherit on them to use them at the bare minimum level. I'm not going to be counting max investment, even though I will be showing max investment builds, because at the end of the day, max investment requires a lot more resources, and that doesn't really boil down to any significant rating outside of how much fodder do you really need. And with that out of the way, I'll be covering every Sword Infantry demo and Grail unit, and whether or not you should invest into each one respectively. So, let's get started. First on the list, we have Ulster or Skahawk, depending on your preference. I personally go with Ulster because that's the one I like the most. Ulster is our newest Sword Infantry demote that can score 185 BST in arena modes, has workable speed, really high attack and defense, and middling res. However, they have no preference weapon or skill of any kind, meaning that it's going to be harder for them to stand out on their own. That being said, they have a lot that they can do as is. If you want to go the bare minimum, you can easily just keep his Spirited Sword, refine it for defense, keep his base kit, replace Astra with Ignis, maybe give him a positional assist. The only thing that's going to be a tad expensive is going to be Special Spiral. However, it should be noted that at the time of this recording, the Double Special Heroes banner with the 4-star Special Spiral demote is currently available. So if you are still looking for something of that nature, you may as well get it right there and then. And then you can also keep his odd defense wave and even defense wave so he can always have ideal active, provided that he doesn't get panicked. And that's at the bare minimum. If you want to go way heavier in the investment side, you could go with a Slaying Edge with Vital Astra and Times Pulse so that he could have damage reduction ready to go from his special. You could stack it up with Spurn and give him Distant Dart and then attack speed for him. So he's basically leveraging on his lower speed. He can raise it up way more with these types of skills, and it shouldn't be that big of an issue to get the full damage reduction at that point, especially if you're using him in Aether Raids or giving him blessing buffs or anything of the sort. And even so, despite the fact that he has no preference weapon or skill of any kind, he can still do relatively decent work, which is why I'll give him a 6 out of 10. 6 out of 10 is still relatively good. However, I do think that just because he is in a bloated pool, it's going to be harder for him to stand out, and not necessarily because he's bad, but just because there are better units. And as far as the cost rating goes, basically I gave him a 6 out of 10, mainly because although most of his kit remains relatively the same, Special Spiral is a tad expensive, given the fact that it's locked on a 4-star seasonal or 5-star units in general. So it's going to be relatively difficult to get in general, but even so, it's not too bad all things considered. He can still make use of his base kit, you can do a bunch of stuff with it, it's not too bad. Next we have Ashram, who is one of the few Grail units that we have that are Sword Infantry, actually. We don't actually have too many now that I think about it. It's mainly in the main pool, but that's aside the point. His PRF Mercurius grants +4 to everything visibly at the start of the turn to himself and any unit that uses a sword, lance, axe, bow, dagger, or basically a beast stone. I really wouldn't recommend using him as an offensive unit just with a single copy because I feel like he's still lacking in that regard. But even so, the fact that he does provide visible buffs is relatively nice just for support. So you can give him double chills, a drive attack. It doesn't matter what you give him in the A slot, so I just kept his wind boost because there really aren't that many supportive options when it comes to his A. You could give him life and death if you want to make him a soaker, but that's about it. Even so, I just figured, yeah, you might as well keep wind boost because, again, there's really not much to the A slot when it comes to support. However, if you want to really invest into him. You could give him bonus doubler with damage reduction. The damage reduction is going to be important over no follow-up in my opinion because his Mercurius does have a 50% conditional. You may as well take the damage reduction. You can run Darting Breath with Noontime so he can heal up fairly well, and then joint drive attack for more damage. Overall, I would definitely say he's still on the side of Ulster, where his PRF is good for support. However, it's not really much better than a lot of the inheritables, mainly because of the fact that you could get visible buffs fairly easily. It's convenient, I'll give it that, but that's about it. And the cost rating shouldn't be too bad because all you really need is chill attack and chill speed, one of which can be ran into Sacred Seal and drive attack. It's really not too bad. Next we have Athena, who has a Wudao Desperation weapon, which is actually pretty interesting because we don't really have a lot of Desperation weapons in general. So the fact that she has one could be really nice just for opening her B slot for budget builds. So basically the budget build I have for her is her Concealed Blade with Moonbow and Reposition. You can give her attack speed ideal from a Muriel, that's easily accessible. And you can also give her Chill Defense if you want to, just so that she can do extra bits of damage. And I also give her double attack wave, so that way she can always have a visible buff active. Again, you could always use some other means of giving her visible buffs, but if you want her to be self-sufficient, it's not a bad idea. Her weapon also doesn't really grant any stats outside of true damage on specials, so you will have to invest quite a bit more into her if you want her to do a lot of work, because as a +1, it may not do too much. However, with a +10, you can actually just remove her weapon and go with Ninja Katana, so that way she can have her Brave effect. You can run her with Winter Bernadetta support, or any other unit with low HP, so that way you can always have her Frenzy going. She can run Flashing Blade 4 and Blade Session, so she can get a bunch of extra damage going. And she can also have Gale Force, so she can easily go in and go out whenever necessary. Even so, I would say Athena is lacking on the attack side, which does suck. And even though she does have Wudao in her PRF, I feel like relying on specials to deal damage isn't exactly the best approach to a unit, especially ones that have significantly higher attack. But even so, I feel like she's still fairly usable, which is why I give her a 5. And 5 still may seem low, but I do think that overall she's not necessarily the worst. Of course, there are better units, which is why she is ranked lower. But even so, she's definitely quite usable, so if you do want to invest into her, I don't think it's a bad idea whatsoever. Next we have Spring Bartray, who has a massive attack stat and a good defense stat, but no PRF. He has Carrot Cudgel, which is basically just a penalty neutralization to his attack and defense if there's any penalties to said stats, and it grants attack and defense +5. As such, you can easily just stack up his attack and defense and give him quick riposte if you really want to do something like that. He comes with auto attack wave already, so there's not really a big reason to swap it out. You can if you want, but I just felt like keeping it. It does the job well enough, even though you could always run other units that provide visible buffs. But even so, the main idea is that you want to stack up his attack and defense as much as possible so that he can take hits and deal damage back. However, if you want to do a bit more max investment, you could always go with the Armor Check set, where you're still stacking up his attack and defense. However, instead of running Bonfire and Attack Defense Form as his Sacred Seal, you have Steady Breath and Ruptured Sky, so this could actually also work as a Fallen Edelgard check if you are looking for something like that. I'm not sure how well it will do at +1, but presumably because of the armor effectiveness and the just enough speed to double her with quick riposte, I feel that it will do the job regardless of merge count. But even so, it's something you may want to watch out for, just against highly merged Fallen Edelgards. But even so, I feel like outside of his gimmick of just stacking up attack and defense, he doesn't really have much else going for him. But I would still put him at a 5 out of 10 because he could still be a really nice check overall for armors and just melees in general. Next we have Crom, who has a really decent attack stat, good defense stat, workable speed, not so high res, but he has really good stats overall. His PRF Sealed Falchion, presumably that's the one you will take because that's the most effective for him in general, is a weapon that has Dragon Effectiveness and can grant +10 attack speed and defense, which can actually make him a really big stat ball. Even at +1, you can stack up his attack and defense and give him quick riposte and rouse, which you can actually get from a Bertram fairly easily, and you can actually make him a pretty decent Ignis nuke, which isn't too bad. He's already going to be dealing a lot of damage as is because the Sealed Falchion has a lot of might and grants a bunch of attack. So that on top of his already high attack, he's going to be dealing a significant amount of damage. However, if you do want to go max investment, you can actually go with a speed build because his speed is actually pretty workable. He gets 10 speed from his weapon, So you can stack up stuff like Distant Pressure, Speed Res Solo, give him a Joint Drive, and Spurn so he can take less damage. And you can always heal back up with Noontime if you really want to keep his sustainability high. He's actually really decent. In fact, I would give him an 8.5, just because, honestly, when it comes to like infantry swords in the demote pool, in the grail pool, I would say he's one of the best ones that we have access to at the moment, mainly because Sealed Falchion is a really decent weapon. He will be a tad more expensive, quote-unquote, to build, even though a lot of these skills are easily accessible. However, I will say that if you do invest into him, he will pay off, and I don't doubt that whatsoever. Next we have Corin, who is basically a run-of-the-mill demote sortie that basically acts as a support unit for the most part. He does have an interesting allocated stat line, which actually works pretty well because he can actually become a stat ball and become a soaker if you really want him to do something like that. His PRF even grants visible buffs to him, and grants +4 to everything during combat to his support partner if they're within 2 spaces. Simple as that. As such, your best bet is just to make him into a support unit. Give him a chill, give him double drive attack, and he's good to go. Basically, you just want to support your support partner as much as possible with him. So the rest of the kit really doesn't matter as much. However, if you do want to go really high investment, you could give him Ardul Infantry to make him an even bigger stat ball. You could give him Sudden Panic and stack up his HP so he can actually be more supportive. And you can still keep the double drive attack. Overall, he's really easy to invest into. He does have a higher ceiling for fodder, but his performance as a support unit is still relatively good, and you don't really need much in terms of investment if you just want the one-off. So I would say he's definitely a solid 7. Next we have Erica, who is definitely interesting because even though with her Resplendent, she still has lowish attack, which can be fine if you do have the right support. And I will put a bit of emphasis on the support aspect because her weapon does work based on visible buffs on allies within 2 spaces. So she's going to be latched onto a unit regardless. So your best bet is to, if anything, pair her up with a really good support unit such as Kaden or whoever that may be. Honestly, I was having a bit of trouble thinking of some sort of budget build. Her weapon is just Hone Attack 3, which is perfectly fine. You could also keep her Hone Speed 3, so at the very worst, you could have an ally with +4 attack and +4 speed. You can give her Fury, so she becomes even more of a stat ball. You can also pair it up with Vantage because of the fact that her HP will be depleting from Fury, and you could give her Attack Speed Form just for more stats. However, if you want to do much more for her investment, you could give her Distant Counter with Spurn and Joint Drive. Darting Breath with Noontime always works really well because she'll be healing a lot. You can also give her Distant Dart or Distant Stance depending on which one you rather prefer. Distant Dart gives her extra speed, which can be really, really good for her Spurn tanking, and meanwhile Distant Stance just gives her overall extra res, so she could become even more of a stat ball. Even so, I find that her damage output is still going to be rather lacking. And honestly, that's kind of what tanks her performance for me, in my opinion. Because even though she could get extra bonuses from her allies, she's still heavily weak to Panic Smoke, which can be a problem. However, investing into her can be relatively cheap if you want to go on the cheap end. However, performance will absolutely vary. Next we have Fear, who has a relatively simple PRF in the form of Slaying and Wudao. And that's pretty much it. Her attack is also really low, her speed is good, her res is actually pretty decent as well, but outside of that, she really, really needs the attack, and you can absolutely tell from her weapon that she absolutely depends on the special triggers. So if you want to do something really simple, you could give her a Fury Desperation build with Blade Session, so that way she could always trigger Moonbow on the second hit, and she doesn't have to worry about doubling because she gets a lot of speed from Blade Session and speed smoke penalties on the foe. The only thing you'll have to watch out for is impact effects. But outside of that, it's a relatively okay budget build. However, if you want to go a bit more on the investment side, you can give her Spurn, Distant Dart, Joint Drive Attack, and Attack Speed Solo. That way she can just stack up her attack and speed and make up for her attack deficit. Every time Noontime triggers, she'll get an extra 15 damage because of Spurn and her PRF, so it's not too bad overall. However, I would also say that her performance is still rather lacking, and similar to Erica, she just does not have the attack set to make up for it. I would say that her cost rating is a bit on the lower end, and the way I'm doing this is basically, if you need to inherit a skill, I subtract the point, And if the skill is relatively expensive, I subtract 2 points. And that's how I'm doing the cost rating. But even so, at the end of the day, these are all easily accessible skills, so I wouldn't worry about the cost rating too much. Next we have Hana, who has an armor effectiveness sword with Swift Sparrow. She's actually really decent offensively, with a 35-36 attack speed offensive stat line. Her HP is low, her defenses are pretty low, but what matters is her offensive stat line, which is actually really decent. She can actually also do a Fury Desperation build with Swift Sparrow and Moonbow. She'll actually end up doing a decent amount of damage. In fact, with this build alone, you can already tell she has 10 attack over Fur, which is really significant actually. And if you were to go way more into her offensive stat line, you could give her a Rhine Sword with Surge Sparrow, no follow-up, attack speed menace, so that way she's doing a lot more damage in the player phase and she's healing. She could always fall to enemy attacks of course, but Surge Sparrow makes it so she's going to have a lot more HP in the enemy phase. However, this does disable any sort of Wings of Mercy strategy, but if you're fine with it, then by all means go with it. I would say just because of the fact that she has 10 attack over Fur, that she does get 1 more point in the performance rating. Her offensive stat line is really good, however her PRF is nothing notable and could honestly be better. It's just one of those things of like having a really early refinement, which is basically her bane, just the fact that she got a refinement really early. But even so, her offensive stat line is really good, so I wouldn't really worry about it too much, especially if you give her an inheritable. Next we have Hinata, who's basically similar to Spring Bartray in the sense where his main stats are going to be his HP, attack, and defense. He doesn't really have speed or resistance, but even so, he can still stack up his attack and defense and do the same thing as Spring Bartray. His weapon is Sturdy Stance 2 with Fury, which is kind of weird because you don't really want to take the chip damage on the tank, so I don't know what they were really thinking with that. So I decided to refine for defense instead. You could just give him his PRF, keep Sturdy Stance 2, and have extra defense from his weapon. You could do the same thing as the Spring Bartray build with double attack defense form with quick riposte, but instead of odd attack wave, you could give him Rouse Attack Defense 3, which you could get from a Bertram. Or if you want to go the similar route, you can also make him an armor check with attack defense form, joint drive attack, Ruptured Sky, and Steady Breath. Basically the same thing as Bartray, however a bit less speed, a bit less attack. But even so, he could still do the same thing with pretty much the same success rate, which is why I'm also giving him a 5 out of 10. I would say like they're pretty similar overall, so I have no reason to rate him any higher or lower. Next we have Itsuki, who has a really interesting PRF in the form of just attack and defense stacking, based on the enemy phase and the player phase. If he initiates combat, he gets attack and defense, and if the foe initiates combat, then he gets attack and defense. So no matter what, he's always going to have attack and defense from his weapon. In fact, he's actually really decent at, like, stat-wise, because he has really good attack, he has decent defense, he has workable speed, he has decent res. Honestly, it's not too bad whatsoever. In fact, if you just wanted to do something simple, you could also stack up his attack and defense, give him quick riposte, rouse attack defense, and steady breath, so that way he could always heal and deal a good amount of damage and keep his sustainability high. However, if you do want to go max investment, you can actually stack up his speed with a boon, you can give him flowers, make him a really decent melee specialist with attack defense unity, no follow-up, and oath. You can also give him steady breath so he can also act as an Ignis Duke on every second hit. And honestly, I'm willing to give him a 6.5 out of 10. He's really well allocated stat-wise, he can pretty much do anything you really need him to. And while the PRF could always be replaced with anything else, I would still say it does the job pretty well when it comes to the melee specialist role. So for that reason, I'm willing to give him an extra 1.5 points over Bartray and Hinata. Next we have Joshua, who also has a really decent allocated stat line. He doesn't have as much attack as Itsuki, but he has decent speed. He gets 33 res from his PRF because it grants res plus 5, and then he also gets another Spectrum 4 if the foe initiates combat, or if the foe's HP is equal to 100%. So basically he becomes a pretty big stat ball. You can honestly just stack up close defense for budget purposes if you really want to. He gets plus 12 defense and res if a foe with 1 range initiates combat on him, which is really, really good. You could give him Wrath, so that way he can always retaliate with a stronger hitting Noontime for sustainability, attack smoke so the foe is not dealing as much damage, However, if you want to do the max investment build, you can pretty much do a similar set, but instead of Wrath, you give him Spurn, so that way he's not only getting true damage, but he's getting damage reduction. You could give him Distance Stance, so he's stacking up his res even more. Speed Res Solo, so he's not taking as much damage from mages. Joint Drive Speeds for the extra damage reduction benefits. And give him an attack boon, so he can make up for his lowish, maybe a bit lower attack stat, even though his weapon does grant +4. And honestly, I would give him the same rating as Itsuki. He is a relatively decent stat ball. However, I would say the niches are definitely different. I would say Itsuki is better as a melee specialist, while Joshua is better as an Omni tank. And even though Omni tanks are a bit phased out, he can still do the job relatively well. Next we have Laszlo, who has a really decent attack stat. He has a workable defense stat. He has a workable speed stat. His res is a bit on the lower side. However, his PRF absolutely makes up for everything. He basically has a 2-space link skill that grants Spectrum 4 to every ally within 2 spaces of him and the ally he assists, except for himself. He doesn't grant visible buffs to himself. And if 2 allies within 3 spaces have more than 10 points of visible buffs, then he basically gets Brave on both phases, which is really, really strong. Honestly, he's one of the easier ones to invest into, in my opinion, because all you really need for his B slot is Vantage. You could give him Steady Breath as his Sacred Seal with Moonbow, which isn't too bad at all. You could give him Fury so he can go into the Vantage range relatively faster. And you could give him Defense Smoke from a Grail unit or promote a Wrath, depending on which one you would rather take. But even so, I would say that Laszlo is definitely one of the better investments you could do. And I know this may sound biased, but I'm trying to be as objective as possible when it comes to this. And then of course you could go way more heavily into the investment side. You could give him Distant Storm with Joint Drive Attack and stack up his attack way more. And basically, the idea is you want to stack up his attack as much as possible. You could also go down the speed route if you really want to. However, I find that this set is way more meta prevalent at the moment, just mainly because there are a lot of skills that can cut down on damage reduction. Even so, I would still say that he is really, really strong for a sword demo, and I would definitely say he gets an 8.5 out of 10. I would rank him similarly to Chrom. I would say if you had to invest into any sword, it would either have to be Chrom or Laszlo, in my opinion. They happen to perform the best at max investment, and they're relatively easy to get into. Next we have Lloyd, who also has a really decent Omni-Tank stat line with a really terrible PRF. Basically, if the foe's HP is 100%, then he gets attack speed +3, and if he's near an infantry magic ally, he gets Spectrum 3. While the latter half can be worked on relatively easily, the fact that it's only Spectrum 3 and then the conditional foe's HP equal to 100% isn't exactly the best, especially compared to modern inheritables like Rhyme Sword, so you just want to ditch that entirely. In fact, you could even just give him a Wudao with Darting Breath and Wrath, so that way he can just keep his sustainability, he can do extra damage based on true damage. However, I would definitely say it's a bit lacking overall on the budget side. Obviously, all units will do better with max investment. However, I find with Lloyd, it's going to be harder to work with him on the budget side. But even so, if you are planning to invest into him, I would suggest giving him a Slaying Edge with Vital Astro and Time Spell so he can have damage reduction from his special, and he can run Spurns for even more damage reduction. You could give him Distant Dart to stack up his speed in attack speed form so he can get even more attack and speed. Lloyd is definitely going to be one of those really hard sells just because of the fact that not only does he cost grails, but you need trait fruit so you can give him an IV, and he doesn't really have the best stat line compared to other sword infantry. So for that reason, I'm going to give him a 5 out of 10 for the performance rating and a 4 out of 10 for the cost rating. I find that he's definitely way more expensive to invest into, and it's not really worth it in the end. But even so, he could still do a relatively decent job if you're willing to invest into him. Next we have Lan Ku, who has a lowish attack stat, but a really decent speed stat with basically no bulk. However, he does have a life and death slaying PRF, which is actually not too different from a lot of inheritables nowadays, which actually works relatively well in his favor just because of the slaying effect. He can basically stack up life and death and give him desperation, so you can actually run him as a really decent Gale Force user with Flashing Blade and Speed Smoke. He's not going to struggle to use Flashing Blade whatsoever because his speed set is really, really high. So you can actually make him a pretty decent Gale Force unit, all things considered. However, if you want to invest more into Long Ku, I would highly suggest merging him and giving him an attack stat, so that way he can actually deal a bit more damage. In fact, you could also give him Flashing Blade 4 so he can get more damage from true damage. You could give him Blade Session Sacred Seal so he's getting more attack and speed. Frenzy so he can actually eat a hit if he needs to. And you still get the Desperation effect, which isn't too bad, especially with Gale Forcing. So overall, it's not too bad. I would definitely say he's a bit above the 5 out of 10 users because he can also use a Ninja Katana set, which honestly also works pretty well. However, I would definitely say the reason I just give him the 0.5 over all the other ones is mainly because he's able to keep his PRF and actually deal a bit more damage in the long term comparatively. Next we have Marissa, who's a really decent Grail unit, all things considered, because even though her attack set could be better, her speed set's relatively decent, and her HP is really high, her PRF absolutely makes up for it because it's a Slaying Edge that grants true damage, so basically it's first PRF as the base, and it has Times Pulse in it, and can grant an additional attack speed 5, which does help with her attack deficit quite a bit. And honestly, you can just run a really decent one-shot set if you want to run Deathblow with Blade Session and then Wrath and her PRF, because even though you'll need to fall below 75% HP for the Wrath effect to go off, if it goes off and she survives another turn, she can have Instant Glimmer ready to go. And since her HP is too high for her to get pulsed, it's actually relatively convenient. However, if you want to invest even more into her, you can actually run a really solid Vital Astra set because she'll have it ready automatically with Shamshir. You can run Swift Sparrow 3 with no follow-up and Defense Smoke so her damage output is consistent. You can run Swift Sparrow 3 with no follow-up and Defense Smoke and Blade Session so her damage output is not only consistent, but it's also relatively higher than it would be at +1 without any sort of boon to her attack. You also get the benefit of having the damage reduction in the player phase because the special will be active by the time she initiates combat, so she'll have the benefit of both null follow-up and damage reduction, which is really solid. Which is why I'm going to give her a 6.5 out of 10. I would definitely say she does rely a tiny bit on her special triggers, which is fine. However, I would definitely say that she could use a bit more attack, and you can honestly use her as a really decent Gale Force unit. So overall, I would definitely say right now I'm kind of in between 6.5 and 7. So I'm trying to be careful. I don't want to necessarily overrate her, but I also don't want to underrate her, depending. So I think 6.5 may be fair. Next we have Masked Marth, who's basically similar to Chrom in the sense that they have the same weapon. So basically they're going to be doing the same thing, except rather than having a higher defense stat, Masked Marth has a higher speed stat. So instead of running something like Ignis Bombing with Steady Breath and Attack Defense form, you'd much prefer something like Fury Desperation because it also activates Sealed Falchion. And as the old saying goes, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. It works relatively well for what it's trying to accomplish. And the same thing is going to be applied with the overall max investment build, where you basically want to stack up Distant Pressure, Spurn, Joint Drive Attack, and Darting Breath so you can have consistent healing, and Distant Pressure will also keep them below 100% HP at all times, so they can always have Sealed Falchion active. It's relatively the same as Chrom for the most part, which is why I'm also giving her an 8.5 out of 10. The only difference is that she basically comes with nothing outside of her weapon, and she costs Grail, so she's going to be a bit more expensive. So if you do want to invest into any of them, you can honestly go with either, so basically it will just come down to preference. Next we have Marth, who's also going to be acting as a support unit. He's similar to Corrin in the sense that you're going to be providing stats to your allies, except Corrin provides more, but to only one ally. Meanwhile, Marth provides stats to every unit within 2 spaces, but only +2 instead of the +4. And you're basically going to be running the same thing as you would on Corrin. You want to stack up drive attacks, you can give him a chill, you can do whatever. And for max investment, you can run the same thing. You stack up his HP, you give him sudden panic, R-dual infantry, double drive attack, etc., and you can make him a decent support unit. Which is why I'm also going to give him a 7 out of 10 for both his performance and cost rating. He's basically Corrin, except he works on every ally instead of one ally. So you have much more consistency when it comes to just supporting your allies as opposed to just one unit. So that will also come down to preference. Next we have Navarre, who actually does work relatively well as a Gale Force unit because of the fact that he has Slank and Quick Impulse 2 in his weapon, which is really solid. The only thing that may be a problem is his attack stat because it's only at 31 base. But even so, you can actually synergize it pretty well with his Blazing Wind if you run Quick Impulse. What he will need regardless is Special Spiral so that he can have consistent specials going for him. Because without it, it's not really going to be doing much. That being said, this mainly only applies to the Blazing Wind set. If you were to go with something like Gale Force, you could absolutely just ditch Special Spiral. You could run Desperation with Swift Sparrow 3, but you also will need Time Pulse if you want the instant Gale Force. So it's not too bad overall. The only thing he'll be missing out on is the Special Acceleration, but he'll have a 2 cooldown Gale Force assuming that he doesn't one-shot, which he probably won't. So he'll double the foe, and he'll end up with a 2 cooldown Gale Force on the next turn, which is perfectly fine. Overall, I would say Navarre is a 6.5 out of 10, similar to Marissa in the sense that even though his attack is a bit on the lower side, I would argue he's a better Gale Forcer just because of the Quick Impulse 2 and Slaying, and even though she has Slaying, it's going to be easier for him to charge up Gale Force. Next we have Nemesis, who is really min-maxed overall. He has really good attack, good defense, good res, decent HP. The only thing that's bad is his speed, but that's whatever. He has a weapon that grants damage reduction based on how many foes have 90% of their health present, and it grants extra attack and defense. So basically you could stack up his attack and defense whenever possible. So basically he can min-max his performance. That's basically the idea. It's similar to Hinata in that sense. And if you want to invest way more into him, you can give him Distant Stance with low attack defense and Joint Drive, so you're basically maximizing his best stats. And you can give him Quick Riposte so he can consistently double in the enemy phase. I would say he's a solid 6 out of 10. The fact that he has to rely on Quick Riposte is a bit of a problem, in my opinion, just because of the fact that it's so easy to neutralize his guaranteed follow-up from it, whether that's with an impact or no follow-up or anything of the sort. But he is going to be tanking a lot, he's going to be outputting a decent amount of damage, so he's not too bad. Next we have Agma, who's similar to Hana, has a really decent offensive stat line of 35 attack and 34 speed. The weapon isn't actually too bad because it's just Heavy Blade that grants attack speed 4 during combat if he's within 2 spaces of a flying or infantry ally, which is really easy to do. If you want to keep his PRF, you can run him with a Link skill and attack speed ideal 3. The idea is that you want to give him as much defense as possible so he can actually take a hit and not die or fall below a certain amount of HP, so he has a bit more sustainability. So you want to give him steady breath and attack smoke so he can raise up his defense stat. You can also give him his innate noontime so he can heal back damage he takes. And if you want to go a bit more on the investment side, you could go with the similar Ninja Katana Gale Force set with Flashing Blade and Time Pulse and Blade Session, which is perfectly fine. I would say performance-wise, he's going to be similar to Hana, which is why I'm going to give him a 6 out of 10. He does the job relatively well. He's honestly not too bad as a Gale Force unit if you give him Ninja Katana. The thing is that he's just going to be relatively expensive if you build him that way. Next we have Olivia, whose stats don't really matter because she's a dancer. She doesn't have a PRF, she has a silver sword, so that's whatever. Basically all you need her for is Wings of Mercy and Dance, because that's pretty much the functionality of every dancer. She doesn't really do much outside of that, so you can keep her base kit and you can give her chill or whatever you want to do. If you want to do max investment, you can make her a Gale Force dancer with Ninja Katana, albeit her damage output won't be amazing, but she'll do enough for chip damage, which is more than enough because she can dance afterwards. So I give her a dancer out of 10. And her cost rating is super cheap, so she gets a 9 out of 10. She doesn't really do anything crazy, but she is a dancer, so at the end of the day, she is going to be relatively good no matter what. Next we have Roy, who's basically just a stat ball. He will require a bit more investment than other units simply due to the fact that his stats are relatively low when he just has the +1 or +0 and no flowers. His weapon does grant defense and res +4 and has Quick Riposte 5 in it, but outside of that, it's not really going to be doing much for his overall offensive prowess and bulk. As such, you can actually just make him into a Dragon Check. You can give him attack res form, low attack defense, attack smoke, and morning breath. The only really expensive part is going to be the low part. It's going to be low attack defense, because at the end of the day, there really isn't much else you could really give him that will boost his performance significantly. You could always give Renewal if you want to keep his Binding Blade active more often, but that's why he has Noontime, so he has sustainability. However, if you want to invest way more into him, you could give him Distance Stance with Spurn and Rouse attack speed and attack speed solo. So he becomes a relatively bigger stat ball. He has Spurn, so he can take less damage overall. And he has decent bulk because of Distance Stance. And he can still take on dragons this way. Overall, I would say he's a solid 6 out of 10. I would say we have better stat balls in the form of Itsuki and Joshua, but he still does the job relatively well. Next we have Rutger, who, similar to Lonku, is basically a lowish attack unit with high speed, and he has a slaying edge, and that's pretty much it. So for budget-wise, you could just give him Swift Sparrow with Desperation and Defense Smoke, so you can actually raise up his attack stat a bit more. He's going to be doubling in most cases, no matter what, because his speed stat is really, really high. So you don't really have to worry about his damage output in that regard. However, if you do want to invest into him, you can keep his Slaying Edge and give him Time's Pulse, so with Vital Astra, so he has damage reduction ready on turn 1. You can also give him Spurn or No Follow-Up, depending on your preference. If you give him No Follow-Up, then he'll have both No Follow-Up and damage reduction, which is a really solid combo. Otherwise, you can run Spurn, and he'll have even more damage reduction and keep his survivability even higher. His attack set is still a bit on the lower end, but Vital Astra should make up for it damage-wise, which is why I'm also going to give him a 6 out of 10. He is also similar to other Omni tanks, however, I also feel that he is lacking in that regard. I would say he's on a similar level of performance with Roy, but outside of that, he's not really doing anything that's going to make him stand out. Next we have Severa, who has a low attack stat with good speed. Where have I seen that one before? She's basically a mini stat ball with no attack, which is what her weapon capitalizes on, which grants Spectrum 3 if her attack is lower than the foe's attack by 3 points, and it grants true damage when her special triggers. So basically, because her attack set isn't exactly the highest, you could basically just make her into a green armor check, which is never the worst thing you could do, because it's always a decent thing you can just have lying around for like Arena Assault. It's never too bad. You could give her attack speed solo, and you don't really have to worry about her missing the attack check, because newer units just have way more attack than her. And it's not going to be that big of an issue in general for her to make the check, because 25 base attack is really low. And even then, let's say she doesn't make the check, you're better off stacking her attack more than relying on just having lower attack, because at the end of the day, you could have a higher ceiling if you just stack her attack. So you could just make her a Spurn tank with attack speed unity, so she can soak all sorts of menaces or chills or whatever the case may be. Give her Darting Breath so she can always retaliate with a special. That's pretty much it. Yeah, you just make her into a Spurn tank. I would still say though, even though she is relatively cheap to build, her performance is absolutely lacking, and similar to Fear and all the other units with low attack, it's going to hurt her in the long run comparatively to units that have an actual attack stat. Next we have Seliph, who has a decent defense stat with a really good attack stat and a really solid PRF that grants damage reduction based on foes who use magic by 50%. He gets attack defense plus 10 and a guaranteed follow-up attack. And the build may seem kind of weird for budget because he already has a guaranteed follow-up attack. However, if he's hit by any sort of impact, he's not going to get it. So having Quick Riposte in his kit isn't exactly the worst if you want to guarantee he has a follow-up. Likewise, you could give him Noontime with Steady Breath so he can keep his sustainability, attack defense form so you're stacking up his attack and defense, which happen to be his best stats. And for a much heavier investment build, you can give him Distance Stance with no follow-up, so that way he doesn't have to worry about impact effects, he gets more res, he becomes a bigger stat ball. Give him Joint Trap Attack so he's dealing more damage, and you can still keep Noontime with Steady Breath so he has good sustainability. And overall, he's a really solid unit. I would say easily 8 out of 10. I would say though that relying on guaranteed follow-ups is a bit worse than just having the natural speed and then running no follow-up or something of the sort, which is why I do think Chrom is a bit better than Seliph, but even so, Seliph is still a really, really solid unit overall. Next we have Dancer number 2, who also has a stat line that doesn't really matter outside of her HP, because you can actually abuse that really well. And she has Barrier Blade, which is whatever, because it just grants res 7 in the enemy phase, which is fine, nothing too crazy. You basically just have to give her Wings of Mercy, and that's all she really needs, and you're good to go. Nothing more, nothing less. However, if you do want to make her way more supportive, you can give her the Chill Attack Sword from New Year Creed, which is expensive, but it's one of the few support swords that we have in the game. You can give her R-Dual Infantry with Sudden Panic and Infantry Pulse, so that way she's not only debuffing foes, but she's also able to support infantry allies, and you just stack up her HP. As such, she gets Dancer out of 10. She's basically the same as Olivia in a lot of regards, however, she does do other things that Olivia can't do, just mainly because of the fact that she can stack up her HP way more. Next we have Soleil, who has a really solid offensive stat line of 38-35 attack speed, and a Fire Sweep PRF that not only grants attack speed plus 5, but unconditional accelerated cooldown on her every attack, which can actually make her a really solid Gale Force unit. You can give her attack speed ideal and hit and run with Quicken Pulse and Speed Smoke, so she can actually either go in and attack 2 units, or you can use her as a hit and run unit. She's going to have attack speed ideal active no matter what, because she's always going to have her HP active at 100% since she has Fire Sweep, unless you run into units that have no counter disrupt, but that's pretty rare. And then for a much larger investment, you could go with attack speed ideal 4 and no follow up and time pulse. That way she doesn't have to rely on Quicken Pulse, and she can stack up her attack and speed even more with Blade Session. Gale Force is still going to do a really solid chunk, and it's going to be hard for units to deal damage to her anyway because she's going to have Fire Sweep active. I would say she's a solid 7.5 out of 10, solely because she is a really safe Gale Force unit to use with really solid defenses. However, her cost is going to be relatively higher than a lot of other units, but if you can invest into her, I promise that she will do you quite well in that regard for Gale Force. Next we have Tobin, who's basically going to be our Grail Selena, except he has a bit more attack, he has armor effectiveness, which she also has, but he also gets Spectrum 4 if his max HP is greater than the foe's HP plus 1, which is which can be way more consistent if you do Merchant up. He has a lot of HP as is, so 49 HP on Merch can actually do pretty well. You can give him Triangle Depth Axe Breaker if you just want to make him into a green armor check. There's nothing wrong with that, especially if you want to use him in Arena Assault. It works perfectly well, especially on stuff like Edelgards. And then you can give him Steady Breath with Noontime, so that way he has sustainability and can keep his Axe Breaker active if he's able to maintain 50% HP or more. Of course, you could also go way more into his attack and defense with Rouse Attack Defense 4 and Attack Defense Solo 4. You can give him Steady Breath with Ruptured Sky so he can also counter Fallen Edelgards. You can also give him no follow-up, so that way he's able to actually double if you invest into his speed. You can actually double relatively easily if you invest into his speed, because his weapon also grants plus 4. But this is still going to mainly be an armor check unit, because at the end of the day, he doesn't really do much outside of that. But because his PRF is a bit more flexible and his stat line is a bit better, I'm willing to give him a 0.5 difference over Selena. And that's about it. And then finally, we have Yanfei, who is arguably one of the more popular Grail units in recent history because he scores 185 BST and has a distant counter PRF with damage reduction built into it. His offensive stat line is also really solid, his defense is pretty good, and his res is not too bad. You can keep Kestrel Stance 2 with Noontime and Darting Breath, and run Wrath, so that way he's healing a bit more with true damage, and he can output a bit more damage in general. Darting Breath is also able to give him a bit more damage reduction if there's a speedier foe. That being said, if you do want to invest more into him, you can give him Attack Speed Solo with Rouse Attack Speed 4 and no follow-up. You don't really need to worry about the stacking damage reduction all too much because at the end of the day, you're just going to get diminishing returns. And you can also run Vital Astra, and even though you're not going to consistently get the damage reduction from Vital Astra, the fact that it is a speed-based special will allow him to do a good amount of damage. The only thing you will have to worry about is stuff like Young Innis and Dual Lift because of the fact that they just pierce through his damage reduction. Or other units like the recently added Tyne, and Deadeye will mess him up. Even so, he is a solid 7.5 out of 10. If he's able to get away with what he's able to do, then he's going to be doing a lot. However, if he does run into a counter, he's not going to be able to do much in that regard unless they take him out in the player phase. And even then, it may be difficult depending on what set you run. And those are pretty much my thoughts and opinions to every Sword, Infantry, Demo, and Grail unit in the game. The goal with this video and the potential series is just to give some advice on what I believe are going to be the better investments when it comes to your resources and your time when it comes to just things in general. I do think that if you are looking for a solid sword unit, you could go with Crom or Laszlo or Seliph. If you need an armor check, you can run Selena or Tobin or Bartre with an Armor Smasher. If you need a Gale Force unit, you can run Soleil or Marissa. If you need someone for your arena, you can run Ulster or Yenfei, and so on and so forth. Basically, I want to give a breath of life to all these units and at least show that even though there are better units out there, that you can at least use them to a significant degree. And the idea with at least giving one budget build and one really expensive build is that if you just want to try something out and the barrier of entry is intimidating, then these sets are here to provide some helpful guidance, in a sense. But anyway, let me know what you think down below. I'm curious on your thoughts, whether you think my ratings are a bit harsh, if you think some should be higher, lower, depending. But regardless, I do think that this could be some sort of helpful series. And if you do enjoy it, leave a like and subscribe or a comment and whatever. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you later.